Okay, so hey guys, in today's video, I have to give some context. Basically, about 5 months ago, I found a video called Objectively Bad Art by this dude called CJ the X, and, whew, it sucked. It was a bad video in a lot of ways, and when I was watching it, I got so fucking pissed off at him that I wrote, like, a fucking essay in the comments about how it sucked and everything that was wrong about it. So basically, this is a response video, I guess. My first response video, imagine that. Um, yeah. So basically, it starts with the quote from the video. I don't remember his voice on it. I'm not gonna fucking do that anyway. That logic does not necessarily work out to examples. That's a group of people. Your waking consciousness is hallucination. Your perception of art is completely cast in the shot of your sentiment, sense of socialization. It's bias in every direction. That's around approximately 18 minutes and 30 seconds in. Many of us have heard these arguments in favor of subjectivity and dismissive logic from postmodernists plenty of times before, and they do not contribute to understanding objective criticisms. A repeated concept in this video is you cannot make objective statements about art, or that these can be quickly dismantled, yet at the 1 minute mark he says, art is all subjective, which is ultimately true, which is an objective and absolute statement about art. This guy just walks through the basic construction and several rudimentary objective criticisms, but starts each with assertions that everything is subjective anyway, or appeals to consensus as the only available objective metric. Thus, no matter what is built atop them at any point in the future, he or anyone else can simply point out the foundational subjectivity or assert consensus as a faulty standard to dismantle these pseudo-objective arguments. Otherwise, this is all pretty much basic postmodernism, where he continually dodges engaging with actual argumentation in favor of any disagreements being resolved with knowledge, or the outcome these arguments are intended to invoke by their speakers. There are several examples below this in the essay. E.g., he knows what those people are trying to say, and therefore it is meaningless to engage them in rational conversation, since that is not their goal. So he doesn't address any rational arguments opposing his assertions. Fundamentally, this is not objectivity in any way. From the social constructivist perspective, objectivity can simply be translated into communicability. So the basic premises he repeats could be agreed upon, and still there would be a structure to objective criticism which he does not discuss at all beyond citing one art critic's book. Once again, these arguments are all just aimed at attacking absolute standards rather than objectivity. As he closes the video, he makes some fine statements about objectivity versus subjectivity. However, it is all in the context of his definition for objective criticisms, which are subjective anyway. My following observations apply to his arguments made in the order of the video. He asserts that he isn't even going to address the points of critics he does not respect because they lack media literacy, gatekeeping and dismissiveness at its finest, and using superficially objective criteria, qualifications for who I will engage with, while leaving all these criteria as subjective. He gets to choose who is worth engaging with based on his assessment of that person's media literacy. His stance is mildly nuanced. He basically says that objectively, all art is subjective, but this being true should not inhibit the usage of pseudo-objective standards in an attempt to improve art, la 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 la, which is fine, but it wholly hinges on whether any statement about art is thus aimed at improvement. Again, leaving everything to the subjective interpretation of participants in the discussion to simply dismiss arguments they do not like by claiming knowledge of the intention any statement is made with. He clearly outlines the all art is subjective as a metaphorical escape button, which applies to any conversation about art. Hence, he is constructing everything he says about objective critique on a foundation of, yeah, but actually it's subjective, and thus the foundation can be eroded on a whim. Which would be fine if he then focused on objective criticisms, their merits trying to distinguish objectivity from subjectivity, but he doesn't explore any of this. His first main point about language of art is just arguing for a functional versus structural definitional system, or alternatively, a top-down versus bottom-up approach. Okay, agreed. But he then says, because functional definitions are being used, there's no convergence, which is incorrect. Each individual function can be objectively defined and evaluated, thus an aggregate assessment requires relative weighing, which many find intuitively subjective, but is not required to be subjective. This is an old argument in probability theory and the basis for many machine learning algorithms. He jumps over discussion of any of these objective criteria to an appeal to consensus, thus arguing it is actually all subjective anyway, based on the single approach he chooses without considering any alternatives. His exploration of anti-convention lacks nuance and obfuscates from the criticisms it is trying to deflate. Technical standards exist. There is no anti-convention for those technical standards, since this would break the definition around the boundary of a medium. For example, it is a convention to use cameras to produce film media. I could make an anti-convention where I do not record visual images for my artistic product, but claim it is all film media. All you have done is broken the definition of film media, but I could veil this as opposition to convention. Most objective critiques I've encountered focus on narrative elements which do not have an agreed upon technical standard. However, this doesn't mean that no standard exists. Claims of extraneous characters, etc., are one of the examples of breaking the definitional standards around narrative. In visual media, some character elements are inherently ambiguous. Examples, motivation, internal thoughts, etc. So we end up in total chaos if we claim that since the artistic product itself cannot yield a conclusive answer mutually exclusive alternatives, therefore there are no possible methods of portrayal which would break the narrative. Example, character assassination cannot exist because characters can change in time, and thus apparently contradictory actions could be explained by character changes, which do not need to be explicitly represented in the media. This is effectively stretching the definition of narrative to an extent that is easily broken, and such a narrative will seem this way for many audience members. All of this to say that just because there are not clear technical standards around narrative conventions, there are still minimally definitional standards which can be broken. So there is not an infinite space of conventions and anti-conventions, which is analogous to challenges in any functional definition system. It only defines boundaries around a singular classification, and lacking this is often meaningless other classifications. It is not clearly a situation of paired opposites. He then reiterates that art is subjective, but there is a consensus. Although consensus as a standard is an aggregate of what he claims are subjective opinions, thus the consensus is also subjective, but he claims that consensus as a standard is objective. Do you see how he just repeatedly walks through the basics of objective argumentation but begins each with an assertion that is subjective anyway? Thus, even if he outlines a supposed structure for objective critique, any of it could just be toppled with appeals to subjectivity. I don't hear those issues. I hear that people are bad, which is in reference to translating criticisms as instead being assertions against oppositional groups. Once again, a postmodernist deconstruction where he dismisses rational argumentation by claiming, rationally, that he holds some knowledge of these speakers' motivations, and thus he can dismiss rational arguments, and instead focus on ethos arguments, persuasiveness but not rational argumentation, which sidesteps any engagement with what the argument is and suggests this disagreement will be resolved by these groups exerting influence over each other. This is basic postmodernism and is fundamentally a rejection of objectivity. He bolsters this argument by citing hypothetical examples. Although I am sure some of these exist. Is this methodology sounding familiar? If I can claim bad faith or repugnance and apply it to an entire group, such as those that disagree with a single assertion, I can thus dismiss everything from anyone in that group as equally useless, rather than engaging the arguments. He also translates the production and effect arguments strangely as stupidity and morality, when parallels more relevant to objective critique are technical versus narrative, coherence, consistency. He cites TLJ and Last of Us 2 and says that those who dislike them do not criticize the technical aspects or thematic coherence. Wow, well, there are technical and thematic criticisms, or both, but most of the criticism about narrative coherence, which he doesn't even bring up as a possibility. e.g., that the sequence of causality is broken, nonsensical, or contrived to the extent of farce. Once again, he simply ignores these arguments, and instead his entire assertion is based on his claims of intent among people who dislike these artistic products, as a means to dismiss objective arguments. His initial statements about production are mostly fine, but he then finishes these points and once again discusses subjective assertions, need, desire, bad under this umbrella, which is unrelated. We experienced it and seek to justify it. This is directly out of postmodernism. Many objective criticisms are focused on the mechanisms by which information is communicated from an artistic product to the audience. He asserts that all rationality applied to art, justify, is post hoc and downstream of emotion, which again simply sidesteps engaging with anything that is said and is mutually exclusive to the idea that there are shared sensory and cognitive methods by which we absorb information, and thus the mechanisms to engage these can be faulty. Once again, he doesn't engage the objective critique claims, but instead asserts his own perspective, which denies that the opposing viewpoint can even exist. Complex stuff. He then talks about Jordan Peterson for quite some time, and again, just asserts what Peterson is trying to accomplish rather than engaging with any of the specific statements made. Then he goes on to claim that consensus is basically the only objectivity, and since he can make claims about the supposed outcomes of Peterson's actions and statements made by people who like Peterson, therefore he knows what Peterson is trying to accomplish, and there is no need to engage with anything Peterson says. This is astounding. It's just astounding how childish these arguments are. They almost all boil down to saying a bunch of big words and referencing philosophers, deconstructing the concept of definition, and then equivocating everything, hoping that the listener will not understand this, and thus any opposing argument can be swiftly deconstructed because it relies on definitions. Meanwhile, whatever opposing perspective this guy wants can be asserted with equal validity, establish equivocation, and since information can be infinitely combined, divided, if you agree with him, he can still point out how he disagrees in a more nuanced perspective, seemingly pointing out how you are incorrect even if you agree. Almost everything he says after the 23-minute 50-second mark, taken in isolation, is great. However, it relies on accurate definitions of objectivity and subjectivity, and throughout the video, he continually asserts that consensus is the only objective standard, which demonstrates a severe misunderstanding of objectivity in artistic craft and assessment. So that's it. I got really into it there. I was actually fucking getting angry again. Anyway, I will leave the actual video in the description for you to go watch because I'm not a fucking loser and piece of shit like him that doesn't actually address the people he's trying to respond to's arguments. So I will leave his video in the description for you to go watch, if you wish. I don't know if you would or not, but whatever, it's going to be there in the description anyway, if you want to. So, see you next time, fuckers, I guess. I don't know.